We are back to our topic on biblical basis of pastoral care and counseling, under which I had, given you some notes on, some understanding about the early development of counseling and how the clinical counseling began to attract Christian ministers, theological seminaries, who began to incorporate the insights of the psychological studies into their ministry. Then also I said that there were suspicions about each other from the field of psychology as well as theology. One extreme was rejecting each other, critical of each other, whereas there are some people who are willing to integrate without rejecting the insights from psychological studies about human behavior, development, and change. Well, I have personally suggested that I personally approach counseling with an integrated approach, qualified, saying that psychological insights come from human rational studies, whereas biblical insights come from God's revelation. And finally, the final authority for us is the Bible. That's the first part that I had covered, and I'm sure that some of you must have debated or thought about it. Then I went through the second part. See, I personally believe that I would rather consider counseling with the name clinical pastoral counseling. I usually call it as clinical pastoral counseling. That means we incorporate those insights that go with Christian biblical teachings. So there is the psychological framework about human development, personality development, crises, various kinds of psychopathology. That means various kinds of symptoms of mental disorders and so on. So we take some of those psychological insights. But at the same time, what is our framework? What is the kind of framework that we approach? What is the internal frame of reference from which we approach counseling? And I said that for me, it is pastoral. It is not even simply Christian. Rather, it is pastoral, which means it indicates a solicitous care, a tenderness, a consideration, a caring attitude for the people, whether it is a Christian or non-Christian. So it is from that perspective that I was trying to take the class. And I said that our primary framework, it would be better to have a framework of a pastor, a shepherd. And I said there are a number of reasons, there are a number of biblical sources to describe it. And I said from the Old Testament, I said from the New Testament also, that Jesus called himself as the Good Shepherd. And of course, various authors introduce him as the chief shepherd, the great shepherd of the sheep, and so on. And of course, he asks his disciples like Peter, John, and so on to feed the lamb, to tenderly take care of the sheep and the flock, and so on. So I have already described it. Of course, in the New Testament also, Christian leaders was considered as shepherds, as it is found in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, that God gave shepherds, teachers, etc. Yeah, see, when we engage in counseling as Christian believers, people who are concerned about the sufferings of others, the brokenness of others, remember that we are walking in the footsteps of Jesus, the carpenter from Nazareth, who called himself as, I am the good shepherd, who seeks the lost ones, who gives his life for the sheep. So it is in his footsteps that we enter into the service of counseling. Let us remember that. So what we need to have is a shepherd's heart, which is concerned. Now, pastoral. Remember, I'm not talking about a priest or the real leader of a congregation. Rather, pastoral, that's a terminology, that's a concept. It gives depth and direction for our counseling. It gives depth and direction. Depth in terms of our concern and care for people. Direction in terms of having life and having it abundantly in all areas of life. So what is pastoral? What is pastoral counseling? What is pastoral care? Remember that it is a logical development of biblical proclamation of God's concern for humans. That means God is concerned about human beings. Now, pastoral counseling. Counseling is a logical development of the biblical proclamation of God's concern for human beings. That means our counseling begins with the biblical understanding of God's concern. God's concern for his creation, for his people. Now, what is his framework? His framework is one of that of a shepherd who is concerned of his own flocks, whether it is the Jews or the Christians. It could be others also. It could be the whole world that he is concerned, because he sends his son for the whole world. So it's actually out of his concern. So our counseling mediates God's concern for the creation. It communicates, it mediates God's concern for creation. Now, remember that our counseling falls within this saving framework. It falls within the saving framework of Jesus Christ. So, in other words, what is pastoral counseling? What is counseling? It is the communication of the word of God to individuals in its broadest sense. You may not be preaching, but you are communicating God's word to individuals. What does it mean? It's a kind of a relationship. It is not preaching. It is not even teaching. Rather, primarily, it is a kind of a relationship that a counselor is meant to have with people. Remember that this care, this pastoral counseling, it is the cure and care of souls. Both elements are there. There is cure because human beings are broken. They need repairing, they need healing. But at the same time, we also would like them to grow. That means there is a need for care. Even after a person has recovered from a bad condition, he still needs care. So here actually the word of God is communicated to individuals face to face. Now let me conclude it here. What is pastoral care? What is counseling? It is a living relationship. It is a living relationship in which healing love is manifested. So it is a matter of being rather than doing. Now, I would like to make a distinction between care and counseling. Now, care, or you call it as pastoral care, it is extended throughout life, from birth to death. When the boy goes to school, when he is sick, when there is an accident, when there is marriage, when there is brokenness in family, pastoral care is there throughout our life. Whereas counseling, remember, it is a reparative function. You are repairing. Once there was a pairing, there was harmony, but due to sin, there was impairment. Now, counseling is helping to repair. That means the person's growth is blocked. Maybe due to crisis, maybe life experiences, loss, conflicts, etc. People need care throughout their lives, whereas they need counseling in times of crisis where they are unable to manage on their own. So I think that will do for us to have some basis to say that our framework is one of a caring shepherd who is concerned, who is willing to risk his life, who is willing to go out, who is willing to seek and save, who is willing to give companionship, who is willing to give depth relationship to the people. Now the question is, what is actually the goal of counseling? There are various understandings about the goal of counseling. But as a Christian, I am trying to look at the biblical basis. What is actually the ultimate goal of counseling? In the common language, we may say salvation. Ultimately, it is salvation. But let me put it a bit more theologically. It is actually the spiritual and ethical wholeness. Spiritual and ethical wholeness. Which is rooted in the biblical teaching. That means it tries to bring healing and growth in all dimensions of life. Healing and growth in all dimensions of life. Healing as an individual, healing in the interpersonal relationships, healing in the family, healing in the community, healing in our institution. So we are trying to bring healing and growth in all dimensions of life. Now, let me also give you some ideas on the biblical understanding of human beings. Remember that we are trying to look at the biblical basis of counseling. Your understanding about human beings, their origin, their nature, their destiny, it is going to determine the kind of counseling and the strategies that you use in counseling are determined. So we are actually very briefly going to look at biblical anthropology. What does that Bible teach about human beings. You may remember from Psalms chapter 8, verse 4, what is man? And of course, the psalmist responds by saying, you have made him little lower than God, little lower than angels. It could be translated in both ways. Little lower than God. So what is our understanding of human beings, whether it is Christian, Muslim, Hindu, whoever comes to us for counseling? So we need to understand what human beings are. What are the human beings? And what is God's call for them? Understanding of human beings, both as they are and as they are called to be by God. It can shape our counseling. It can shape the goals of counseling. It can shape the attitude of the counselor. See, secular psychologists, secular frameworks emphasize personal autonomy. It is based on rational thinking. Secular psychologists believe in personal autonomy of individuals. That means man doesn't need any supernatural guidance, support, etc. Man is born with potentials. What he needs is favorable conditions for full realization. You call it as self-actualization. See, this is what is promoted by secular psychologists. Now, let me ask you, never expect a psychologist to talk about God. He's not a theologian. He's trying to look at human beings from his scientific framework, which caught scientific framework. He believes that it is science. So he believes in the personal autonomy of individuals, that he can manage his own things. He is the one who decides. He decides his destiny. He chooses what he wants. Whereas biblical anthropology or biblical understanding of human beings begin with God. That's what we find in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God. God created the heavens and the earth. In the biblical account, you especially read Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. You'll find that it is God who creates human beings. It is God who gives human life meaning. As a counselor, as a Christian, we have unique or particular point of view about human beings. Why do we look at it? Because this is going to determine your attitude, your approach, your counseling perspectives. When we approach any human beings, Hindus or Muslims or from any religious background, we approach them from a perspective of Christian faith, Christian view of man, Christian view of man's relationship to God. So the whole process of counseling is going to rest on the answer to the question in Psalms 8 verse 4, what is man? So we need to have a very clear understanding about what is man, what is human beings. Well, there are various scientific views. There is sociological view, there is biological view, and of course there are various anthropological views about human beings. There is the evolutionary viewpoint. There are various viewpoints, but we don't accept everything. We actually look at every viewpoint from the biblical perspective. We try to critically look at each viewpoint and determine what is right in the light of the scripture. Now let's try to answer the question, what is man? Let me run faster. Well, what is man? What is man that thou art mindful of him? Now, there is the biological and spiritual nature of human being is evident in the Bible. The physical or the biological and the spiritual nature of human being is evident in the Bible. Well, of course, you will come across in Genesis chapter 1, it says, God says, let us make man in our own image and likeness. Genesis chapter 2, you will come across, God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So first of all, let us be aware of the fact that man shares, of course, man, woman, shares the physical and organic levels of life with other living creatures. There are a lot of similarities between the animal kingdom and human beings. We share a lot of things. Therefore, we are also subject to the process of birth, death, suffering, pain, and many of the realities of our existence. Well, when we share these things with the other animal kingdom, we must also know that man is also distinctive. How is he distinct? Because he has existence on another level. The Bible uses the word, man became a living soul. Another language is that man is created in the image of God. So actually, the human spirit is the synthesis of the unity of the biological and the spiritual. So the Bible says that we are created in God's image. We may not be able to do justice to the concept of the image of God, but let me give you very briefly some of those ideas. What is actually the image of God? Of course, the Bible speaks at least very clearly, at least on three passages, Genesis 1:26, Genesis 5:1, Genesis 9:6, where it is very clearly, explicitly said that we are created in God's image. Of course, there are several other references in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians 11:7, James chapter 3 verse 9, Ephesians 4:24, etc. Now, what is actually the image of God? See, and when any person comes to us for counsel, remember that everyone is created in the image of God. He may not subscribe to your faith. He may not subscribe to your values. He may have altogether different understanding about morality, values, God and so on. But remember that everyone that who comes to us for counseling is endowed with the divine image. So what is actually the image of God? It's a divine endowment. It is the ultimate dimension in man's nature. So it is a capacity for, let me try to very briefly comment on that. It's a capacity for self-awareness. We are able to reflect upon. And self-transcendence. We are able to go beyond that. Now, man has the capacity for awareness of the presence of God. Awareness for a creator God. He has the awareness of meaning on a level beyond this earthly existence. We may call it as the image of God. It is actually the image of God that enables him to rise above the animal kingdom, transcend the biological nature. Well, it may be a capacity for a level of autonomy. It's not complete autonomy. Now, it can be an openness of the human person to God. It can be an openness of human person to other persons. It's a spiritual basis for human response to God. It's a spiritual basis for obedience to God as creator. So this is what we may say about human nature. Primarily, let us conclude it by saying that we are created in God's image. We share his wholeness. We share his holiness. But we also need to note that humans are not gods. We are not gods. So we, as created beings, we need to be aware of our finitude, our limitations, our brokenness. We are aware of our potentialities, but at the same time, the fact that we are human beings make us aware of our finitude, our limitations, our brokenness. If we do not acknowledge our finitude, our limitedness, we may fall into self-idolatry. So this gives us a foundation for understanding human being. This helps us to approach every person with great respect, with great hope that there is the image of God in every human being. Also, although we also acknowledge the fact that all have sinned and come short of that glory, that image, it was marked. See, this is one side of the picture of human being. The other side is that human being is a fallen sinner. There is the brokenness. We need to have a proper understanding of human brokenness. He has alienated from God. You call it as an estrangement. We have moved away from God, who is the ground of our being, who is the center of our being. Of course, man endowed with the image of God, he has a longing to develop, to recover his image of God. So the Bible is very explicit about the fact that human beings are sinners. All have sinned. Ultimately, human conflicts and brokenness are rooted in the strained relationship of man with God and with one another. So there is that inner crippledness in every human being. This is something which we cannot ignore. So to conclude that, we must know that human beings are broken due to his broken relationship to God. So he is unable to realize the image of God in him, but he has a longing for God and for that image to be realized. Now, in history, we also know the fact that God has taken the initiative to restore man to the perfect relationship to God. Of course, this we find in the history of Jesus Christ himself giving his life for human beings. So I'm not going to describe it because you know theology. So we believe that every human being needs to go through the process of new creation. We call it as salvation. For him to be fully restored to the image of God. So we cannot be neutral about human sin. Now, counseling becomes a framework through which we are able to communicate God's love to the broken, crippled human beings. It is through our relationship that we communicate God's love. And the ultimate purpose of counseling thus becomes new creation through Jesus Christ, so that human beings will be restored back to the destiny that they were created for. I will also present one more thing. I thought, since I am talking about the biblical basis of counseling, I thought I will give you a model of counseling in the New Testament. In order to do that, I have taken the story of the encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus, which is recorded in Luke chapter 19. Well, I personally see that the encounter between Zacchaeus and Jesus Christ gives us a sense of direction in counseling. I repeat it. The encounter between Jesus and Zacchaeus gives us a sense of direction in counseling. See, actually, what is the problem with Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was a man who was incongruent. Incongruent is a language used in mathematics. See, there is what is known as equilateral triangle, equal sides and equal horns or degrees. When it is not equal, it is unequal, you call it as incongruent. That means they are not harmonious. With human beings, whenever any person comes for counseling, this is one concept which helps me to understand human beings. Everyone who comes for counseling is incongruent. Here is a person who is violent. That's a real man. That's his real behavior. Whereas deep down he feels guilty and he would like to regulate his behavior and become gentle. Gentleness is that which he wants to be, that which he desires to be. So there is real and there is ideal. Here is a young boy who writes his examinations and he gets only 35 out of 100 for mathematics. And he cries. He feels so sorry about it. The real is 35 and the ideal is 90. He wants to obtain at least 90% in his examination. When there is a discrepancy between the real and the ideal, let us call it as incongruent. People who come to us with any kind of problem, remember that there is a real and they are not satisfied about the present condition. They have certain ideals. There are certain ideals that they desire to grow up to. Now, let me try to connect it to Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was a man who was incongruent. He was a man with a sense of inferiority. Physically, he was shorter, but he wanted to be very tall. He was shorter than others. But the interesting thing in his personality is that here is a tendency in him to overcome that which is the real in him. What does he do? He climbs the sycamore tree. He tries to overcome his limitations. Now, let me try to connect it. Let's suppose that you're throwing a potato into a dustbin. It doesn't have favorable conditions, but it begins to sprout. It begins to overcome because it is born. The potato is with certain potentials to grow. To me, the way that I look at this, every human being is born with certain potentials. To me, the image of God is the greatest potential that he's born with. Therefore, he feels not satisfied about his present behavior. So he struggles to overcome it. Every person who is an alcoholic, who may be violent, who may be discouraged, they want to somehow overcome it. So here is Zacchaeus tries to climb the sycamore tree, overcome his limitations. Professionally, he was inferior. See the real. He was a tax collector, chief of tax collector. Remember that he was despised by the Jews. They looked down upon the sinners and the publicans. But the other side is that in spite of all his inferior feelings, he made a different life by his hard work. That's the other side of his personality. Socially, he was inferior because tax collectors were regarded as traitors. But on the other hand, he wanted to overcome it. Spiritually, he was inferior because he himself confesses saying that I will give fourfold if I have a wronged anyone. So he felt guilty. So there is a search for truth in him. Finally, we may say that he had very poor self-esteem. His real self and the ideal self were in constant conflict with each other. That's the reason that he searches for reality. That's the reason that he comes to Christ. Now remember that this is the reason that many people come to us for counseling, because they're dissatisfied about the real, the present. How did Jesus approach this case? How did Jesus approach? How did Jesus help him? Let me run through it. One, as a counselor, I look at it as a counselor. Jesus sensed the need of Zacchaeus. He was very sensitive to the need. Remember that his eyes were open and his feelings, his heart, it was all open to the distressed person. Who can be a good counselor? A person who is sensitive to the needs, the troubles, the difficulties, the conflicts, the pain, the sense of loss that others are going through. That will make you primarily a person who could become a counselor. Sensitivity, it is a shepherd's character. Sensitivity. When Jesus asked the disciples to cross the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and then when they were rowing in the middle of the night, and Jesus sensed their need and he walked over there. Sensitivity. Second one is that if you look at this encounter, which is a model for counseling, he made a personal contact with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was trying to hide himself on the sycamore tree. However, although he wanted to look at Jesus, see Jesus and so on, what did Jesus do? He came down just below the tree and he looked up. It says he looked up. What does it mean? Here is an eye contact. He maintains an eye contact. He calls him by name. To me, Jesus builds a healthy rapport. And Jesus gives him an identity, one among the crowd. But now he singles him out so that he will be able to attend to him personally. In counseling, one of the major things that you do at the early stage of counseling is attending personally, so that the person would definitely feel that I have come to the right person, a sense of belonging, a sense of trust. Third one is he developed a rapport by his initiative. Jesus took the initiative. It was not Zacchaeus, but Jesus took the initiative. Other counselors, other psychotherapists, they may expect people to make appointment, come to their office and so on. Well, here actually it is the counselor who takes the initiative. He goes out of his way to meet him. So he builds the rapport. The fourth thing is that, remember that he invites him, come down. What does it mean? He offers him help. Remember that counseling is never forced upon anybody. Counseling is something which you offer to people. Now, Jesus' approach was that he offers help to Zacchaeus. Fifth, he offered him unconditional acceptance. You call it as love. You call it as respect. You call it as positive regard in psychological terms. Positive regard, acceptance, unconditional acceptance. See, he doesn't look at what he has been, what Zacchaeus has been doing. Jesus doesn't preach anything about any of those things. Rather, he offers him counseling, he offers him help. He says, see, I want to go down with you and I want to stay with you. So it is acceptance without condemning. Jesus doesn't have a judgmental attitude, condemning attitude, rejecting attitude. He doesn't evaluate him because Zacchaeus himself knows what are his failures. He doesn't advise him, rather he accepts him with respect. Sixth, Jesus helps him to discover his potential. Remember that the Pharisees said that, Jesus is going to stay with this sinner. He calls him sinner. Doesn't he know that he's a sinner? Whereas Jesus says, now he is a son of Abraham and salvation has come unto his home. This is what we do in counseling. We help people to realize that there is something precious in him. There is the image of God. There is deep down within him certain capacities. People are not aware of it. So helping him to discover his potential. And then, of course, as a result of that, he develops an insight. Zacchaeus develops an insight that I am. He discovers himself. This counseling relationship helps him to discover himself. And what is actually the result of such a relationship? Let me go through it once again. Sensitivity. Second one is attending him personally, looking at him, and then asking him to come down. The third one is building up rapport. Fourth one is offering counseling. It is not forced. The next one is acceptance. That means positive regard. And then, of course, gives him an insight that he is son of Abraham. And all these methods, all these ways of person-to-person relationship brings an insight into him, and it brings change and growth. How do you know that there is a change? He commits immediately to dispose his material wealth. And he says, I'm going to start a new life. I'm going to give out, going to sell half of my property, give to the poor. So that means the change is visible. Jesus is not forcing it. Jesus is not advising him, but he has an insight about his personality, his limitations, his problems. So he's ready to dispose the material wealth, start a new lifestyle. This is what we found in counseling. There will be change. And of course, then secondly, he commits to make restitution for his faults. If I have wronged, so it helps him to go for a self-reflection. He's able to reflect upon his past. Remember that past is a ghost which has been haunting him for a long period. So he commits to make restitution for his faults. Finally, he transcends his inferiority and discovers a new identity. What does it mean? There is healing in his personality. There is healing in his identity. One, there's a big change. This commits to dispose his material wealth, start a new life. Here's a new creation. And commits to make restitution for his faults. So he's willing to rectify the faults. And thirdly, there's a healing in his person. Now Jesus calls him as a son of Abraham. So here is a new identity. There's a change. So there is holistic healing in the life of Zacchaeus, in his values, in his identity, in his commitment to God, in his commitment to serve others. Well, I will conclude it there.